Today's video is a bit of a cross between an aircraft overview and a development topic, as we're going to be looking at the unsuccessful but highly important series of flying boats built by the Hiro Naval Arsenal in Japan. Not a great deal of information is available about these flying boats, and as a full disclaimer, I am relying on just two sources in this case. Both, as usual, are listed in the video description, but one of these books does not have an English translation. Because of this, I apologize in advance if there are any errors in terminology, as that might be the result of a translation issue. Anyway, why are we looking at Hiro, you ask? Well, in many ways, they were responsible for developing and establishing the importance of flying boats within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Being an island nation, Japan was one of the most suitable countries for flying boats to get a real foothold in the post-war period of the 1920s, but Japan's capacity for producing flying boats was almost non-existent at the time, and so new production facilities were needed. The Hiro Naval Arsenal, often abbreviated as Hiro or Hirosho, was established in August of 1920, and it was to be the Navy's first dedicated aircraft repair and manufacturing factory. At the time, two naval aircraft factories were operating at Yokosuka and Sasebo, but space was limited owing to these factories being smaller, having not been originally designed with aircraft production in mind. This new Hirosho factory was completed in October of 1921, and the first aircraft it produced was a license-built version of the Felixstowe F5. At the time, this was considered one of the best twin-engine flying boats in the world, and when the first of them visited Tokyo with a flypast in October of 1921, they thoroughly impressed crowds with their speed and size. The first of these planes were built with the supervision of engineers from Short Brothers, one of the many companies that built Felixstowe's. They brought over several partially completed F5s, but once everyone was satisfied that Hiro could produce the aircraft without the need for training wheels, full production began at the factory at the end of 1921. The engines used in the license-built F5 were imported Rolls-Royce Eagles, which put out 360 horsepower. But the Hiro Arsenal eventually began to produce 400 horsepower Lorraine engines under license as well, and in 1925 they experimented with installing these engines in one of the F5s, redesignating it as the F1. As the power of the engine increased to 450 horsepower with later models, another flying boat was again modified and redesignated as the F2. Hiro had initially expected these more powerful models to go into service and replace the F5s, but the design of the airframe was considered obsolete by mid-1920s, being based on design concepts from the First World War, and only the F5s were taken into naval service. Additionally, by the time the experiments were carried out with the new engines, work had begun on the designs of the next generation of naval patrol aircraft. While the F5s were merrily patrolling the Japanese coast and local waters, experimentation had begun with all-metal flying boats. This came in the form of equipment from the German manufacturer Rohrbach. In 1923, the Japanese Navy sent officers and engineers to Germany to study the new construction techniques that were being pioneered by the company, and in 1925 the first components had been sent across to Japan for assessment. This led to the construction and evaluation of what was essentially a Japanese-built Rohrbach R1, which was subsequently used for various static and flight assessments. During this time, there was a bit of, friendly competition between Mitsubishi and Hiro to become the favoured producer of flying boats for the Navy. Mitsubishi took the opportunity to establish the Mitsubishi Rohrbach Company in Berlin, where parts and components for new flying boats were manufactured, apparently in an attempt to control the market back in Japan, and they manufactured an experimental flying boat that was known as the R2. Not to be outdone, the Hiro Arsenal built a follow-on flying boat, with enough changes to not infringe on the new so-called patents that had been taken out by Mitsubishi Rohrbach, and their flying boat was dubbed as the R3. Powered by a pair of 450 horsepower Lorraine engines, the R3 was a quintessential blend of Japanese and German design thinking. Unlike the original Roebuck design, the R3 had rounded wingtips, and the wing's center section had no dihedral. The wings and hull were slightly larger, to better accommodate crew and equipment, and to accommodate this change, the wing floats were redesigned to improve takeoff performance. The changes resulted in an increase in speed, but an unacceptable reduction in climb rate and takeoff capacity owing to an increase in weight. The R3's shortcomings in addition to weight were its poor ability to cope with waves of any size and its high power loading. As a result of this, it was never put into production, but valuable experience was gained in the production of all-metal flying boats, and the experimental R-planes of Hiro and Mitsubishi would influence Japanese design thinking for the next decade. In 1926, 5 years after the F-5 had entered service, the Navy decided to develop a replacement to be built at the Hiro Arsenal. This time it would not be license-built, but designed with the Navy's direct needs in mind. The project was to be based on the experience gained from the F-5s, and it was to implement new technology that had been brought over from Short Brothers, but it would still be a design unique to the Hiro Arsenal. The whole design of the new aircraft closely resembled the F-5 with its wooden structure, but the wings were a completely new design. Though the all-metal R3 was innovative, its weight had been a major problem, and so Hiro went with a lighter single-bay biplane. The first prototype was completed and flown for the first time in August of 1927. Although some minor modifications were needed, the aircraft proved to have good performance, stability, and handling characteristics. It was officially adopted by the Navy as the Type 15 flying boat, more commonly known nowadays as the H1H1, and it was put into production at the Aichi factory in 1927, and then at the Hiro factory in 1929, when the current production run of the F-5 had completed. The production model, like the prototype, had a hull of wooden construction covered with plywood, wooden wing and tail structures covered in fabric, and a pair of wooden floats connected to the outer wing struts. Powered by 450 horsepower Lorraine engines, early production models were fitted with bench-type aileron balancers, but later on, more effective horn-balanced ailerons were installed to replace them. Other production modifications included vertical fins near the tips of the tailplanes, and the wingtip floats had their construction materials changed from wood to metal alloys to improve strength. As production of the H1H1 got underway, work began on an experimental model that was designated as the H1H2. This had an all-metal hull of the same shape as the original, with Dornier external stiffeners added, and the additional stabilizing fins of the previous model was removed as the original horn balancer on the rudder was scaled up. Equipped with the same engines as the H1H1, it was 2 miles an hour slower, but significantly stronger, and had much better endurance on the water. Once its evaluations were complete, it was officially accepted by the Navy for production in 1930, marking the first time a metal hull flying boat, built by Japan, had entered service. The third production variant, the H1H3, was actually meant to be the second, but a delay in acceptance for its new engines meant that it did not enter service until after the H2 model. It was powered by a newer Lorraine 3 engine, still producing 450 horsepower, but now driving 4-blade propellers. The wings and tail were identical to later production H1s, but a minor adjustment to the overall airframe and hull resulted in a weight reduction of 600 kilos. Combined, the H1 series were the first successful flying boats that were designed and built in Japan, and they were built in enough numbers that they were one of the Navy's main flying boats until 1938. They mostly performed coastal patrol duties, but they also acted as mail carriers, and sometimes also operated as naval transports for officers. The next aircraft built at Hiro, the Type 89, or H2H1, was in many ways an all-metal version of its predecessor, but there were some noticeable differences, and this stemmed from its design origins. While Japan was learning from the radical monoplane designs being created by Roebuck, it was decided that a more conservative, tried and tested model was also needed. And so, near the end of 1928, the Navy imported an all-metal Supermarine Southampton from the United Kingdom. It revealed many innovations in all-metal hull design, some of which influenced the design of the experimental H1H2, and the Japanese Navy hoped to further incorporate these innovations in a replacement for the Type 15 flying boats in general. After performance testing at Yokosuka, the Southampton was ferried to the Hiro Arsenal for further study, after which design work began on a new aircraft. Unsurprisingly, this design bore a striking resemblance to the Southampton, with a noticeable difference being the incorporation of a single tailfin and rudder in place of the Southampton's triple arrangement. As mentioned before, the hull was all-metal in construction, built as a semi-monocoque, and its upper surfaces had a rounded contour so that where the fuselage met the hull, there wasn't a pronounced outward flare in its shape, which was a hallmark feature of the previous aircraft. This was done to improve streamlining and aerodynamics, and it was an improvement that was incorporated into most other Japanese flying boat designs at the time, and almost all future designs moving forward. By the autumn of 1930, the prototype was complete, and it was submitted for naval evaluation. Despite an unfortunate incident where a ruptured fuel line led to the complete immolation of the first prototype, the rapid production of a second, complete with minor improvements, led to it being accepted into service as the Type 89 in March of 1932. Production was begun not only by Hiro, but by Aichi and Kawanishi as well, the latter of which was tasked with producing major subassemblies for the Hiro production line to speed up the whole process. Known as the H2H1, the aircraft was well regarded and liked by its pilots, and it proved to be a thoroughly reliable airframe. However, its production run was relatively brief, with only 17 units being built, and this was due to the rapidly evolving standards of airframe design in the 1930s, that rendered most designs obsolete within a matter of years, if not months. As a result of said rapid development, these would be the last of the Hirosho flying boats that were completed as biplanes, though some other manufacturers continued the trend for a few more years. By 1930, Hiro was the most experienced manufacturer of large flying boats in Japan. Because of this, plans were developed that year for the production of a far more ambitious project, the first large all-metal aircraft entirely of Japanese design. It was to be a 3-engine aircraft, capable of covering long distances, maintaining full operational flight on 2 out of its 3 engines, and it would be the first Japanese aircraft designed to carry a 1-ton bomb. The knowledge and experience gained from the Type 15s, the experimental all-metal R3, and the Type 89s was combined into a single package. The new flying boat was a cantilever monoplane, embodying the proven Wagner box spar acquired from Rohrbach, and the strengthened hull features learned from the Type 89. The prototype was complete in 1931 and given the designation of Type 90-1, with a competing design by Kawanishi being designated as the Type 90-2. With a wingspan of 31 meters, or just over 100 feet, it was one of the largest all-metal aircraft built in Japan up to that point. The only other aircraft at the time to beat it was the Ki-20, and that was a license-built aircraft rather than a domestic design. In fact, it was the progenitor of the Ki-20, the Junkers G-38, that had prompted the design of a large flying boat in the first place. Weighing in at just under 8 tons when empty, and sporting a range of 1,100 nautical miles with a 13-hour endurance, the Type 90-1 demonstrated a rapid improvement in the design capabilities of the Hirosho naval arsenal. But unfortunately, it was not a success. The prototype was flown to Yokosuka for a series of initial flight tests. During these, many problems were encountered which necessitated a series of modifications. These included moving the radiators further aft under the engine nacelles, experimenting with various propeller designs, as well as minor adjustments to the control surfaces. To improve handling in flight, additional vertical fins were added to the tailplane, and struts on the horizontal surfaces were relocated so that the angle of incidence could be adjusted. With each modification, a new dash number was assigned, and so the final configuration of the aircraft was known as the Type 90-1-4. Unfortunately, these modifications had taken too long, and in fact some problems seemed almost too difficult to solve without major redesigns, and so Kawanishi was awarded a production contract for their design, which became the H3K. It should be noted that the Kawanishi model, though successful, was essentially a redesigned amalgamation of a short Singapore and a short Calcutta, rather than a determined attempt at a brand new design, and as such its design process naturally had less teething problems. The single Hiro prototype, though innovative when compared to the more old-school, semi-copycat design of the Kawanishi, was thus relegated to a life as a flying testbed. Most of its flying time was used in testing a new series of 940 horsepower radial engines, then under development by Mitsubishi. Before the prototype Type 90 had even been completed, work had begun at Hiro on another flying boat design in 1931. This was intended to replace the existing fleet of Type 15s and Type 89s, and it was in essence a scaled-down, more practical version of the previous three-engine design. During the prototyping phase, this series of planes encountered numerous problems that required a multitude of alterations. As a result of this, several prototype aircraft were built, each one with its own unique configuration, and this led to an incredibly protracted development process. A lot of this was due to the challenges found with all-metal designs, notably striking the balance between strength and weight, and this was compounded by a general lack of experience. After all, most Japanese manufacturers in 1931 were still using all wood, or at the very most, mixed construction in their aircraft. Originally, this all-metal aircraft was powered by two 500 horsepower, water-cooled Type 91-1 or 600 horsepower Type 91-2 engines, and these were mounted on struts above the wing. After repeated tests and modifications over a long period of time, they were replaced by a set of 760 horsepower air-cooled Miyojo engines, which were a license-built version of the Pratt & Whitney Hornet. Other changes to improve the design involved moving the shoulder-mounted wing to the top of the hull and repositioning the tail. There were other subtle changes as well. Nearly each prototype differed from the previous one in some way as efforts to improve the design progressed. This of course took time, with changes still being made years after it entered service, and by 1937 efforts to further improve the design were stopped, as the whole thing was becoming obsolete anyway. The many variations in these designs led to two separate designations for the type. The earliest configuration, to be accepted by the Navy, beginning in the summer of 1933, was the Type 91-1, also known as the H4H1. These had the original water-cooled engines, but after multiple changes, which included repositioning the hull steps, switching to four-blade propellers, and changes to the tail, they represented a fairly different design when compared to the original. When more advanced models were then re-engined with the Miyojos, and changing air screws again to three-blade units, the decision was taken to redesignate these aircraft as the H4H2. That being said, there were still discrepancies within both variants. Some had shoulder-mounted wings, some had high-mounted wings. Some had either a straight or a tapered trailing edge, and some were equipped with varying types of flaps, often made by Junkers. Despite the huge drive to improve performance, the design persisted in throwing up problems with instability, both in the air and on the water. This meant that even as the first so-called production units were being built at Kawanishi's factory, under the designation Type L, further experimental design changes were carried out by Hiro. This led to further uncertainties about the design, and dramatically slow production as existing models were gradually updated. As a result of this, only 47 of these aircraft were built before production was terminated in favour of the next generation of more modern designs. Though they could not be deemed a glowing success by any metric, the H4Hs do perhaps hold the claim of being the first Japanese flying boats to see action in a war zone, though there is still some debate as to whether a flying boat built by Mitsubishi beat them to it. They saw service throughout the Sino-Japanese War, albeit in small numbers, patrolling the coasts of China, and serving as mail and cargo transports between China and the home islands of Japan. Overall, the small series of flying boats designed and built by the Hiro arsenal were not successful in their own right. They were dogged by development problems, which led to redesigns and delays, meaning that many were obsolete when they entered service, or they were simply not chosen over other designs which had taken direct lessons from their hardships. Because of this, the Hirosho flying boats have been mostly relegated to obscurity, despite their historical significance. The Imperial Japanese Navy became well known for its love affair with flying boats, particularly those built by Kawanishi, but it was Hiro who pioneered the design of these aircraft in Japan, and in many ways it could be said that their aircraft failed so that others could succeed. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the patrons, with a special shout out to Kevin, Deliardo, Bain, FB, Christopher R, Tronathon, Eric Heineman, John Austin Jr., Ray Carlotta, Keith Tarrier, Green Sea Ships, Northlinks Web, MCT, Ted Parsons, and Capitano Lorenzo for their support as Wing Commander tier patrons. Thank you all so much, and I'll catch you all next time.